So now I want to, and I know Tash and I, we did a podcast together, and we spoke, some of the questions that I'm asking are going to come up, and I'm sure you're going to recognize them, Natasha. But I think one of the things that have certainly has caused maybe some concern relates to the pandemic. So now we are in the so-called post-pandemic times, and of course that's not true because we are still experiencing people having Omicron or becoming ill, and so it's so the question about how has technology or how has teaching and learning in higher education changed from what it was before the pandemic and now, if you like, post-pandemic times. We can't really talk about that in depth, but I'm sure there are things that maybe you, Natasha, you can talk about, that some of the changes.
Yes, absolutely. So before the pandemic, I think there was online teaching and online learning, and there were very discrete online courses that were developed specifically for an online audience. And then suddenly during the pandemic, certainly Swinburne academics had to put all of their face-to-face courses online. And it takes a long time to develop a really good online course. So it was a rapid change to online. So there was a lot of support that was required for teachers to be able to do that. Technical support, for one thing. I remember the first day when it was all new to me, and I was recently, I was 6 months in the role, and still learning the learning management system, and had a lot of questions coming in about how does the learning management system work. So I'd say the biggest change would be that the affordances of the learning management system are being used more now. Because they have needed to be. I think previously the learning management system was where a lot of the resources sat, but there wasn't much learning written around that and integration into that. Whereas now I think, and that takes a lot of time to develop. So I think teachers are now looking at that, and the blended learning team within our team are supporting teachers to blend their units more to that. So that is one change, I think.
And of course Melbourne experienced one of the harshest lockdowns in the world. And how do you think that affected, I'm sure you worked with your academics. How did you kind of get a sense?
It was such an interesting time. I had so much empathy for the teachers, having taught myself and speaking to my colleagues that I used to work with and hearing their firsthand, the things that they were saying as well. I live in a house with three children who are in high school, so they were learning. My husband's a high school teacher, so all of us were learning and teaching and working in the house at the same time. So I understood that a lot of there would be a whole range of different experiences going on in every house that is challenging. Our bandwidth became quite low because we were all trying to use the internet at the same time. There were some terse words going around. So I think teachers have done so much that they've got to be exhausted now coming back into face-to-face teaching, which is really exciting for some, but also challenging in that a lot of people now in Australia are getting sick now because we kept the numbers down, but there are a lot of people away at the moment.
And of course winter in Melbourne doesn't help.
No.
Over to you, David. What kind of challenges do you remember the time during COVID? How was it what was the challenges for you?
I think the biggest challenges were when you're working from home, it's making sure that you tailor your setup at home to work as effectively as possible. There's nothing worse when you're trying to teach a group of people how to use a technology online that's an online piece of technology. And your bandwidth, your internet connection is not good. It might drop out, or someone else in the house is watching Netflix, or, and all of a sudden your fabulous picture and video and your sound disintegrates to nothing, or power outage occurs and you don't have any sort of backup, battery backup to keep you going. All these things are a problem. And we noticed one of the overwhelming things, and I'm sure everyone would agree with this, is that all of our staff had differing levels of technology at home. Mm-hmm. It was not the same as what they had at work. Some people were able to take what they had at work home, but then they had the challenge that it wasn't the same setup as what they had at work. Mm-hmm. So at work they may have had multiple screens. At home they only had one screen or just the laptop or whatever. Mm. So there were technical challenges, and that was a big one, I think. The technology itself, once they overcame that, then things became a lot easier for staff. They felt more confident teaching online. They felt more comfortable teaching online. And they were able to deliver better online. We saw some remarkable sessions where staff were delivering classes to 500 plus students online. Mm. And that's a remarkable feat in itself, even when you're doing it in a lecture theatre.
Mm. And was that only one lecturer?
No, there were several. They're from different disciplines. So first year subjects often tend to be quite large. Mm. So when you're dealing, say, for example, if you look at, say, something like computer science or accounting, those are large classes, psychology. First year subjects, lots of students. And then as the years progress, they focus in more on whatever particular stream they want to focus in.
I'm just curious, if you have 500 students, but would you have them all at once? Is that, or would they be I'm thinking that surely you can't have 500 students and my goodness.
Yeah.
And maybe 50 or maybe.
So technology-wise, some of the technologies we use scale well. Right. So they can support thousands of students online simultaneously. Mm. But you have to think about the mode of delivery.
That's right.
Right.
Yes.
So these in some cases, some of the technology we used is interactive, but will only support, say, 250 students at the same time. Mm. Then you've got a more sort of didactic delivery broadcast system, which can support thousands of students because it's one to many as opposed to many to many. And the technologies they used accordingly. So if someone had a large class, they may look at, say, for example, we have a technology called Echo 360, which we use for lecture capture, but you can use from home as well. And it does live streaming. Right. And that has unlimited seats. You could have tens of thousands.
But it's one way.
It's one way.
That's correct.
Yeah. So I would say that one to many is probably less challenging than the people who came to us and said, how do I get my students talking to each other? Yeah. How do I get what was going on in the classroom to get that interactivity? I don't know whether they're listening to me. I don't know whether they're engaged. I don't know whether what I'm doing is all right. So they were the sorts of questions. And I think, Antoinette, you did a fabulous interview for our podcast that spoke to
Asanka, yes. And the good thing was that some teachers really were innovative and they came up with some really great ways to actually work around some of these challenges that they had. And to be honest, sometimes it's just about rethinking how you're used to doing things. So how can you actually maximize on what the technology actually has available for you? So even if you are not able to do it synchronously, which is what people are used to, if you are in a classroom together, you can actually break them out and actually have those discussions. How about maybe having an asynchronous discussion as opposed to having a synchronous discussion with the students to capture those types of discussions with students? So it's just about thinking a different way of doing it in the mode that you had. And many teachers, and particularly Asanka, who I spoke to, had some really great suggestions, which is why we captured some of her thoughts as part of that podcast to share some of those strategies across the institution and to learn from one another. So people really were innovative and came up with some creative ways to actually, get around the challenges that they were experiencing.
That is a very good answer, because we have two in Sweden. We have academics who had, say, for example, 70 students, and the challenge there was I'm not sure if it was the engaging with students, but it was actually keeping ahead and keeping in touch with the chat. And it just wouldn't work, 70 students, hello.
Yeah, yes.
And so there was some academics who had 2 people, so
Yes.
one checking having a look at the chat and responding that way. But the technology has gone so fast, and I don't know about your experiences here, and I will be happy to hear some. But I know in Sweden, coming back, if you like, in post-pandemic times, there is quite a bit of resistance to technology. Some have found online teaching really great. They're looking forward to being back on campus. We love catching up with, seeing everybody face to face, having a coffee. But when it comes to, if you like, providing the flexibility to students to be both on class, face to face, and teaching online at the same time, there is a resistance against that, and also a little bit of negativity towards technology, which and this comes to the different terms associated with technology or new ways of learning, whether you call it blended learning, hybrid learning, high flex learning, flipped learning. I mean, hello. I'm getting pretty confused when I think about all the different terms. So I want to go over to Tash. How do you explain these terms, and have you experienced a negativity from?
I think that's a really interesting question, because when I hear people talking about blended learning or hybrid learning, I wonder whether we're all talking about the same thing. Or whether people have in their minds something that's very different. And I think it's really important to actually state up front, what it is that you're talking about when you're talking about blended learning. So at Swinburne, blended learning will look different across different disciplines, because different disciplines have different needs. But it is essentially that there is a blend of face-to-face, real-time learning experiences, and self-directed online learning experiences that are asynchronous. And so rather than all the teaching being in the space of a face-to-face traditional lecture, tutorial or tutorial lab, there might be, depending on the discipline, depending on the needs of the students and the outcomes, or the learning outcomes, a unit that has every second week 3 or 4 hour face-to-face workshops or face-to-face learning, and an expectation that students are going to engage asynchronously or synchronously, maybe online, together to learn outside as well, and bring that learning and then discuss it within the classes. Hybrid learning is a little bit different. In my mind, hybrid is when there is, for instance, a presentation that has a face-to-face audience that is in the room and a virtual audience. So that's quite challenging for teachers to be able to look at the camera and look at people at the same time. And we are looking at our spaces around the Institute to see how we can support that. And then there is this new term, high flex, which is looking at teaching that can be hybrid, face-to-face and online, but also have asynchronous experiences that are equal to what might have happened in that discrete period that the presentation was, for students who cannot be there. So they're not missing out. They're not just watching the recording.
You confused me now.
I confused you. Okay, so I should have stopped somewhere in between and asked you whether you were following rather than kept going.
Thank you. Just kidding. This is Australian humour. Over to you, David. Can you explain a little bit? How do you understand it? How do you explain it to academics?
From a technical perspective,
Yes.
I mean, certainly what Tash and Antoinette have spoken about is the way we see hybrid or high flex terms. We use the term high flex at Swinburne at the moment. This is part of the project that we've received some government funding for, to help our offshore students so that they feel connected to a face-to-face lecture.
Yep.
In terms of the technology itself, it's sort of, in my mind, it's fairly obvious what you need. You need a camera for starters, right? And it has to point at somebody, right? Now that may be the lecturer and it may also be the class.
Yes.
You also need the students coming in remotely. So we need a technology that will support the students coming in to a virtual classroom. And that could be a number of tools. There are plenty out there. We currently use a tool called Collaborate Ultra, which is made by a company called Blackboard. It plugs into our learning management system, the LMS, and it allows a synchronous, real-time classroom event with multiple students, all online at the same time, all being able to talk to each other if you wish. You have the ability to turn the cameras on and off, their microphones on and off. There are other tools that do this. Microsoft Teams, Zoom, Skype, those sorts of tools do a similar sort of thing. But when you're talking about in a traditional teaching venue, I won't use the word lecture because, you know, we're reimagining the lecture. So, but if you look at it in a teaching space, for example, trying to imagine how your students would appear as if they were real in the room poses some challenges. And we speak very closely with our IT colleagues who look at the technology that's available in those teaching spaces. And they're looking at possibly even having multiple monitors that take up a whole row at the back of a teaching space with individual students on each screen so that you feel like they're in the room.
But then, David, that poses the question and the challenge when we need to think about what the students want as well. Yep. Not all students will want to turn on their cameras.
Correct.
And that is completely fair as well, because there can be so many reasons why a student might not want to. It might not be appropriate to turn on their camera. That was one of the biggest challenges and one of the biggest questions that we had during the pandemic was, how do I get students to turn on their cameras? And then we would need to ask, you know, why do you need?
And you know, that is a really good question, because we've had the same thing in Sweden, and we had the issue about the internet connection. You know, some students couldn't get in, and so there were a lot of issues. But there was also the issue about the camera. You feel very conscious, self-conscious. You know, how do I look? And there were especially, you know, a lot of young girls who were all dolled up. They went and fixed their lips and whatever. And I used to think, well, what's happening to learning? But having said that, I think it caused quite a bit of stress. So, and you know, so for me, it was a matter of, you know, I'd like to see when I did attendance, I kind of, hello, how are you? And they turned on their camera and you greeted them that way. And then afterwards I said, now you can turn off your camera and please turn off your microphone so that we don't get any feedback if you happen to be in the same room. And it worked beautifully. But I think it's got to do also how we set up the class. Yes. But the challenges we had related very much to the technology. So it wasn't always that, and I'm not really necessarily keen on having a camera following me like whatever I do.
You know, it might be beneficial for the teacher to see whether the students are engaging or not, like they would have been able to in the classroom. But if there is all the other students, that extra cognitive load when they should be concentrating on the screen sharing.
Yes.
I've been thinking about that as well. And you mentioned before about the chat. The chat and listening, reading the chat at the same time as trying to listen to what the lecturer is saying.
Yes.
These are all issues that are very human issues.
Yes, absolutely. And you know, it depends again who we are as teachers. How do we connect with our students? And I'm very clear. Your focus is on the PowerPoint or whatever presentation, whatever presentation style you use, but it's actually on the content. But then it's also to make sure that the students are continuously engaged. And how do we know they are engaged? Yeah. Well, there are ways of doing it. And I actually did listen to your podcast. It was very interesting, Antoinette, because I love podcasting, as you know. But it was a great way. And I think it's a matter of all academics or teachers, how do you engage with your students, whether it's you put them, and I like the idea of discussions, open discussions, but they're timed.
Yeah. Can I just add there, you made a very valid point earlier, Liisa, about being clear about how you set it up, but also communicating that to the students. If the students are clear about the rationale of why they need to turn on their camera or, mute their
Yes.
their mic, whatever it is, as long as they're clear exactly why they're doing it, I think it's important we just also involve our students. There's always an assumption that they'll just get it. If
No,
I do
they
it, they'll just get it, but then they don't know why they're doing what they're meant to be doing. So it's really important in the beginning to be clear about the etiquette that's expected in an online environment, given that we all had to shift quite quickly. It's new to us. So really be clear about, this is the reason why I'm doing this. I want to engage with you, and this is how I'm going to go about doing that. So just be clear with your students, communicate that before doing it,
yes.
and then we can learn from that.
Yes, and before we can do all of that
Sure.
really successfully,
Yeah.
our technology we must understand
Sure.
what is this, whether it's Zoom or Teams, that we don't get stuck. And then, of course, we want to be absolutely sure the infrastructure is going to work.
Yeah, that's
so,
right.
you know what I mean? So, because as teachers, the first thing that happens, we blame ourselves. If the sound doesn't work, we start thinking it's our fault.
Yes.
And you get all this flushed and flustered, and
Yeah.
and it's not, and that's where I'm very much about, if we have a good infrastructure, everything is working, we understand the little things, because even I can sometimes forget to turn on the microphone, and everybody turns on the cameras, and they go, Liisa.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But yes.
Yeah, I was just going to add, it's incredible how even now, it's like nearly 2.5 years into the pandemic, people still, you're on mute, we're human. And I think it's important for students to also see that. Like, you are not perfect. Like, we don't know the technology, and we will make mistakes. There's nothing wrong with that. And I think there's this idea that we have to be perfect in front of the students.
Yes.
We can just say, oopsie, laugh at ourselves and just move on right along. I don't think they're judging us in any way.
Oh,
and
yes,
really
they are.
taking it too hard and too much at light, I think is what it is.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think we are too harsh on ourselves.
We are.
And that's where sometimes, look, I think we're all different as educators, and
Sure.
whether we are, and I think it comes back to the thing that you were talking about. It's like, do you have that experience understanding students? And I think the most important thing, and I'm hearing that from all of you, is, the pandemic, that it's caused a lot of fatigue.
It has.
We don't only suffer from digital stress, staring at the computer screen, but we also suffer from actually being tired. And you put it beautifully yesterday when you talked about the tiredness, the fatigue of the pandemic, that, when you recognize teachers, you speak with teachers and who you want to support, you recognizing them that they are tired.
Yeah, they just need time to take their breath. There's been so much change, rapid change, and everyone has gotten on board and done that. And with that change, there are so many benefits. Like have been, videos have been created, some fantastic forms of learning have been created. But to, in embracing that again as we've come back, teachers just need to take their breath. It's,
Absolutely.
everyone's a bit exhausted.